Hello, my name's Ben Page. I'm the Global Chief Executive of Ipsos. We're in many countries around the world, thousands of people in our teams. And what I want to talk about today is our views on the perils of prediction. The bottom line with being human is that we really do think about the future all the time. It's actually one of the things that distinguishes us from other species. We really do think about the future. The challenge is that we're very often wrong about it, whether we're predicting what's going to happen, or indeed when we think about our own futures. And if you're interested in your own future and what might make you happy, I strongly recommend you read a book by Dan Gilbert, professor at Princeton University, called Stumbling on Happiness, because all of us make bad judgments about the future. It doesn't matter how rich or famous or clever you are, you're generally going to be wrong about the future. The man who was heading IBM in the 1940s, who predicted that probably the world needed about 5 computers in total. That would be the total number that they would need. John Maynard Keynes, one of the greatest economists who ever lived, said that by 2030, we would be doing a 15-hour week. And I don't know about you, but I'm almost certain that 15-hour week by 2030 is not going to happen. The man at Decca, there are mostly men making these predictions, but we'll talk about that in a second. The man at Decca Records in 1962 who turned down the Beatles because he said there's no 4-piece groups with guitars are finished. That wasn't very true. Or indeed the man who is, again, another man, I'm afraid, the man who was in charge of the US Patent Office in 1899 who said that everything that can be invented has been invented. So forget planes and computers and the internet. It had all been invented in 1899. Or indeed Lord Kelvin, again, one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, who said that X-rays will prove to be a hoax back in 1883. He was wrong. So generally we're wrong. And I think one of the reasons why we're wrong is because we find it sometimes hard to imagine how dramatically different things could be. And we take straight line assumptions. We assume that the future will be like the present or the past, just more futuristic. Look at this picture of Paris in the year 2000, imagined at the beginning of the 20th century, with lots of gentlemen with nice beards and waistcoats and the fashions of the time, but with some new equipment based on the latest early 20th century technology. So got it completely wrong. And of course, in my own childhood, I imagined that I would be visiting the moon on a regular basis by 2021. When I was growing up, we watched something called Space 1999, which was already about living on the moon in 1999. The fact that we stopped going to the moon in the 1970s and didn't go back was not part of the plan. So our biases are really a huge challenge to us all. And I think trying to be aware of our biases, particularly as researchers, is hugely important. We can see that, for example, people just misestimate all sorts of things. There's estimation bias. There's the biases we have because of who we are and our own experiences. One reason why it's so important to have different teams. So overall, we've got 6 out of 10 people who think that recycling as much as possible will actually be great in saving the planet and reducing climate change. In fact, that's about number 7 out of 20 or 30 things that you could do as a human being to help save the planet. It's not going to have anywhere near as much impact as people think. We can see all the time in our work that when we ask people about what the world is like and to imagine just what they think is going on, we can see that we're wrong. And whether you're British or Italian or French or German or American or Chinese, you're very likely to be wrong. This is one of my favorite examples. In this election a couple of years ago, the Italians elected a combination of parties that did things like didn't really believe in vaccines for measles. They were very, very anti-immigrant. But when you look at Italians' view of their society at the time they voted those people in, what was going on? Well, they believed that 3 out of 10 people in Italy were migrants. The actual figure was about 9%. They thought that half the population of Italy was unemployed. Now, unemployment in Italy is high, but it's only 11%. And they believed that half the population of Italy was over the age of 65, was retired. Now, there are a lot of old Italians sitting on benches when you visit Italy in the summer, but there's not half the population. The actual number is about 22%. So people very, very wrong about their own societies. And when you start to get them to think about the future or the distant future, it's likely that they'll be even wronger. And one of the reasons why we're so wrong is sometimes that we just really aren't thinking that hard. And I think that's why researchers and futurists and people looking at trends perhaps are going to think a bit harder than somebody just answering an opinion poll. And hopefully we will be better. But the reason, I think it's still very interesting to look at why people are so wrong. And the reason why people are so wrong, of course, is that sometimes you're seeing things like emotional innumeracy. People in Italy are worried about the fact that they're one of the oldest aging societies on earth. They're worried about migration. And so when a pollster asks them a question about it, they give an estimate that reflects their anxiety rather than perhaps something that they've reflected on a bit more deeply. But nevertheless interesting in terms of the level of anxiety. And the other bias that we all suffer from is optimism bias. We all believe that we're going to have brilliant careers, our children will have wonderful lives, we'll meet somebody perfect, marry them and live happily ever after. And you can very much, the old saying that marriage is the triumph of hope over experience is almost certainly true. Speaking as I'm on my second marriage, it's much better than the first. Strongly recommend second marriages if you haven't tried them yet. But look at this, among Chinese citizens, 44% say that they're going to win the FIFA World Cup in Qatar this year. I can bet with you now, anybody wants to come and have a bet with me about whether China is really going to win the World Cup, come and see me after this event, and I will bet you any amount of money you like they do not win. But 44% of the Chinese believe they will. So again, optimism bias is a clear problem. Now, polling that we're often involved with can predict events very accurately. This is the recent British election in 2019, and the average error of the polls was 0.6% out for each party. Now that's pretty good. People sort of saying, oh, polling doesn't tell you anything, or it's always wrong. Well, look at that average error for each party there, ranging from between 0.3 to 1.6, but a pretty good result, quite frankly. And interestingly, if you look at all election polls in all countries of the world where records exist, going back to the 1940s, interestingly, and just as something we should perhaps pat ourselves on the back about as an industry, the average error on average in all elections in all countries since the 1940s has averaged about plus or minus 2% for each party's share of the vote. So sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse, but the average is plus or minus 2%. And given the challenges in terms of attaining representative samples, the dynamism in politics, the fragmentation sometimes we see in politics, as the academic Professor Will Jennings, who's done this analysis, says, it is remarkable, given the huge changes in survey methodologies, that actually the absence of any change or clear trend is remarkable. And so polling is as accurate or as inaccurate as it's ever been, but it's certainly better than virtually any other method of predicting what might happen in the near future. So polls can tell us a lot about what might happen in the near future, but when we want to go into the slightly distant future, 2, 3, 4, 5 or more years into the future, of course, we need to start looking at things like the cone of possibility, looking at a range of things that are plausible, probable, the things we might prefer, the things that are possible, or even the things that possibly are preposterous, the wild cards. And actually, I think the experience of the pandemic shows that if you are looking at scenarios of for the future, including some pretty out there events that may be low probability but high impact, has become all the more important. And of course, as this chart shows, the further into the future you go, the greater the level of uncertainty. And we've already seen all of those very well educated, very well connected men make completely erroneous forecasts about the future or the distant future. So we need to be careful, and I think in our work that we can do by including some more unlikely scenarios, that helps us be better equipped for the future. So I think there's a lot of evidence that we can get better at foresight. Many of you will have read Philip Techlock's books around forecasting, or indeed the book, the analysis on things like the wisdom of crowds. More people together do it better than one person on their own. And interestingly, people who are not involved personally or have no axe to grind about a particular issue are more likely to be accurate. It was very interesting to me in Philip Tetlock's work that groups of forecasters who were not in Washington or San Francisco or Chicago or New York, but often retired professionals sitting, just reading the evidence, sifting the evidence in an iterative fashion, working together, refining their forecasts, turned out to be far more accurate than sort of the latest expert in Los Angeles or New York, which I think is fascinating. And sometimes I think if you want to make decisions, what you need is someone who's pretty well read, pretty good at sifting evidence, and really doesn't care about the particular business problem or challenge that you're asking for a prediction on. And those people are likely to be more accurate than somebody who has been working for years on getting X to happen or Y to happen. So there's lots of things that we can do. Our way of looking at it is to sort of look at it in different layers. The macro forces that affect the whole world, those deep currents that we can see happening now and that we know are going to have an impact, those shifts and trends in human society that we measure all the time, and those signals that we can see, perhaps out on Main Street or the High Street or in the mall, where we can see immediately that something is changing. So those, it goes from deep down to slightly more substantive, and then to the things bubbling on the surface. If we measure change at all of those levels, we're more likely to be right about the future. And of course, all of those things are interacting with each other. So, the macro forces are clear. Demography, as is often said, is destiny. We know there will be more Nigerians than Europeans in just a few short years. We can see the economic data on inequality and how money is going to people who own assets rather than people who earn a living working over the last decades. Geopolitical tensions you can read about daily in newspapers. Data world, I don't need anybody at this conference to talk to about that. I think technology tipping points are something, the interaction of different technologies and how those come together, I think is something to really think about. And then, of course, the overall ecosystem that we're living in as animals on a planet, in an environment, our fragile planet, climate change, and indeed COVID-19 itself. All of those things, sort of macro forces, and indeed zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, but like SARS, like MERS, or like HIV, are always with us. In fact, most of the diseases human beings suffer from have come from animals at some stage, whether it's a bat or a monkey or any other sort of animal. And those will keep coming. So perhaps we should be aware of that. Whether a laboratory was involved or not is another matter. So we can also see shifts that point us towards the future. We can measure those. So trends like the rise of concern about climate change. It's gone on through the pandemic. It's a clear trend that the public is getting more and more concerned. It's the one thing that globally everybody agrees on. The challenge is, of course, they don't necessarily agree on the solutions, but we can see that concern about climate change is rising. In Britain, where I'm standing now, we have the highest ever level of spontaneous concern about climate change, partly prompted by the holding of the COP26 conference in Glasgow. But overall, you can see globally, it's risen markedly over the last decade. We can see that there's optimism about the impact of science. So while there's lots of fake news, while there's lots of disinformation, while there's lots of sort of loony stuff out there in WhatsApp groups or YouTube, overall, and indeed helped by the vaccine production, where we've done something that would normally take up to a decade in just a few months, we've got more and more people believing, for example, that all medical conditions will be cured. So one of the clear trends over the last decade is actually a rise in trust in science. And we can see that overall, despite the problems of globalization, particularly in the West, where sometimes people feel they've lost out compared to rising countries in Asia, overall, generally, more people than a decade or so ago say that globalization is actually good for their country. So there are lots of shifts in societies that we can see. But of course, rooting our predictions just on past trends only takes us so far. So we need to ask ourselves a question constantly: how do we get better? So I think one of the challenges that looking at past trends can only take us so far. And as we've already seen, predicting the future by just extrapolating from the present leads you to the barber shop in 2000, looking like a barber shop in 1900, but just with some newfangled machinery in it. So it only takes us so far. COVID shows us that wildcards matter. So in terms of how we can get better, I think the first thing is really thinking about your own biases. I am an educated, middle-class, white, British person. I'm quite different from, perhaps somebody who's grown up in part of Africa, someone who's grown up in part of America or China. And so it's really important, I think, to understand that your teams and your individual life experience, your memories, and really reflect on who you've got in your team. The more diverse teams you have, the more likely your work thinking about the future will be accurate. And there's a real risk that you've just got a group of people who are all quite similar in background and are comfortably sitting there. Even very clever people, as we've already seen, can be very, very wrong. So the more diverse people you have, the better you'll be. Secondly, interestingly, the less involved people are in the actual decision at stake, the more likely they are to be right, because sometimes one's emotion, you want something to be right, means that you're biased. Personally, as a man running an international business, I couldn't believe my own data when it showed that 51% of the British public on the morning of the referendum were going to vote for leave. I looked at the data from the week before, I looked at a whole load of other empirical data, and I said, there's a clear trend towards actually staying in the European Union. And that was bias at work. I should have just trusted the data. So we need to look at, as well as trying to remove our own biases and expectations, we also need to look at the data we're gathering. A key issue is not so much polls and data being wrong, but of course not including the right or asking about the right things. All of the predictions for what was going to happen in 2020 didn't include a small virus from Wuhan. All of the predictions about the 2008 crash were mostly wrong. They just weren't there. So we need those wild cards. We need to be aware of our biases. And if we do that, and we've got diverse teams, we're more likely to be right. We need to keep asking those what-if questions. And we need to get better at living with uncertainty. That's something that human beings find difficult, and you can see in Western societies that actually confronting them with a much more uncertain future makes them pretty unhappy. Hence Trump, hence Brexit. But it's a pattern that we can see across the world. And indeed, in Latin America, currently the angriest continent on earth, a lot of this is about old certainties or patterns of direction stopping. And so, back in 2008, for the UK government, we produced a Sigma scan in 2008. We said one of the scenarios we could see was the bio breakout. We said likelihood medium, impact high, a new and lethal virus strain, highly adaptive, capable of human-to-human transmission, could swiftly result in a global pandemic. The outbreak could occur in several waves and last 2 or 3 years, proving lethal to millions across the world. So that was back in 2008. You will all have seen Bill Gates' predictions of a virus breakout being massively disruptive in his TED talk of just a few years before the pandemic. But the fact that we can make these predictions doesn't necessarily mean anything unless we're actually able to make a change. So COVID-19 is a good example. We could predict the headline, but the details were pretty important. Many countries thought it was going to be like flu rather than something rather more deadly. So a key point that I think anybody looking at the future really needs to take seriously is to build scenarios for the future, none of which contain the perfect truth, but all of which perhaps contain elements of truth. In this example, produced again in 2008, but I thought it was interesting, it was produced at the very beginning of 2008. We talked about a super crunch in a centralized world, with a lot of convergence, but we could also see a more distributed, divergent world. You could see, you've got the two axes, centralized and distributed, convergence and divergence. And if you take the super crunch scenario that we adopted, really interesting. We called it Mr. Orwell meet Mr. Huxley, painful recession, high dependency, terrorism and mass migration, escapism, fantasy, celebrity, pervasive sensors. We started talking about mass data set, the Internet of Things, behavioralism and modeling, social engineering. Not all of that came true, but quite a lot of it did. And so that's quite a helpful way to be ready for supercrunch back in 2008. How are you going to adapt your business to that? So scenarios are certainly something that we might want to look at. And in the last few years, we've learned, I think, we've just been reminded by the pandemic about things that we can do better as human beings and as businesses in terms of prediction. So the first is that I think it's clearly tricky and it's going to stay that way, but I think using foresight in a structured way lets us be ready for the future. It makes the future in some ways more knowable by having those different scenarios and tracking over time as you go through the cone of possibility to the future. You can see what might be more knowable. We also think that the role of wildcards is important. Do not accept that straight line forecast of growth. The future is just too complicated. And ultimately, of course, all of this is about getting resilient, being prepared, contemplating difficult futures. If you do that, you don't have to put all your resources into being ready for every scenario. We don't have enough resources. But if you do that, we have the flexibility to respond as businesses, as societies, and as governments to whatever the future throws at us. And the 2020s, at least, mean that we need to do that more than ever. Because as we go forward into the future, my predictions are that, clearly we're moving to a multipolar world, away from a bipolar world. We're moving from being worried about climate change to doing something about it. We have to stop talking about digital and physical and just talk about blended reality. And our political leaders are under constant pressure from rising groups of social leaders, people outside the normal political sphere who are demanding change. The bottom line is more unpredictability, not less. That's my prediction for the future. Thank you very much.